Well, we have a fantastic panel with us today, and I'm going to dive right in. The session is titled, All Bits Are Off. The Munich Security Conference always has great puns. And we want to talk about really two associated topics here. One is, the title session says, the risks of racing for tech dominance. I would phrase it slightly differently. Do we need to think about winning the technology race? And who is winning against whom? So I would argue that the United States and Europe and our friends and allies have a real stake in leading, in not all, but certain important technologies vis-a-vis authoritarian regimes like China and Russia. And I would put in that bucket probably artificial intelligence, semiconductors, 5G and 6G, a couple of others, but not everything. So I want the first part of the session, we're going to talk a little bit about, is there a race on? If so, what areas are important for us to win in? And then the second part of the session, I'd love to talk about, if we agree that there is such a race on, how do we win? Is it by hobbling the other guy, by holding them back with export controls and others, or is it by leaning forward ourselves, or a little bit of both? So to kick us off, I want to throw this question to you, Senator Warner. You've done a huge amount of work on this in the Senate. You've authored some of the best legislation in this place. Do we need to win the tech race with China and Russia? And if so, which technologies matter the most?
Well, thank you. And also, for those of you who are watching, the room is totally full. Could we get some of the extra standing room people to come in so we can crowd in a little, because this is an incredibly hot session.
It is.
Yes, I think, in China in particular, we have a technology peer that we've never faced. Soviet Union was a military foe, and it had obviously an ideological challenge. But with China, we have a peer nation that is not playing for second place. And I should also quickly add that at the forefront, regardless of what the Vice President may have said, there are many Americans who believe in our alliances with Europe, like Europe, and believe that we have shared values and a shared future that we must work together. And frankly, I think there is a vast majority of non-authoritarian regimes all over the world that are looking for that combined U.S.-European leadership. On the tech issue, the one thing you didn't mention was that all of this good legislation, virtually none of it has become law, because Congress has been, with the exception of Mike's bill on TikTok, has been awful on actually getting things across the finish line. I do think, it took us a long time, for example, to figure out that Huawei was a real threat. We started that in 2017. We were slow at making the case. I think people realize that in the telecom space. I agree, AI, I agree in the other areas. I would put bio in that space as well. Just as, 8 or 9 years ago, nobody had heard of Huawei. The next major Chinese entity that people will be talking about a lot is BGI, Beijing Genomics Institute. And frankly, AI combined with bio may have more power than any of the other domains involved. And then finally, and I don't know if you want us to go into the nitty-gritty details at this point, but in AI...
This is a hardcore session.
I know this is a hardcore, but I want to make sure I got to save the good stuff for so they don't, so that the standing room crowd doesn't leave too early. But in AI, the ground has shifted so many times. Kai-Fu Lee initially put out the presentation that he had the most compute, the most data, and the most just pure number of engineers would win, and China clearly had those advantages. That did not prove to be the case yet. But as we think about it, as somebody who was very involved with, I think, well-intentioned but probably not well put together on the AI diffusion rules from the Biden administration, are numerical caps on GPUs even the right metric? So what is the right metric? We ought to talk about. I've got some ideas on that. I would say, Mike and I worked together. Mike got the bill across the finish line, even making the case that some of this technology that comes from nation states that are adversarial to us, and it's not that many. There's only 6 in American law that are noted that way. Has been a really hard slog. The notion that 170 million Americans, 90 minutes a day, on a platform that is ultimately controlled by the CCP, that shouldn't be that hard to say, not only from a data collection standpoint, but from a plain propaganda standpoint, that that's a national security threat that we have to win on. So I think we're still sorting this out, and I'm anxious to hear from my colleagues on the panel in terms of their ideas.
Perfect. Thank you. I was going to go into the whole internet and social media tech stack later, but since you raised it, I think maybe let me go to Frank. You've written a lot about when people sometimes ask, why do we need to win the tech race against authoritarian regimes? The folks who work on the national security space say, well, there's a lot of dual-use technologies, this is dangerous. You've written a lot about the values embedded in technology. Frankly, as Americans and Europeans, we were so dominant in the tech race for so many decades that it was automatic. The internet was invented in the West, so it embedded our values. That's no longer the case. Can you say a little bit more about how you see that values discussion and what you propose that we all do about it?
Yeah, sure. If I asked you all to define democracy, I don't think the words surveillance, centralized, autocratic, exploitive, manipulative, et cetera, would leap to your mind. So the Project Liberty's premise is that centralized, surveillance-based technology that puts so much power in the hands of CCP or any individual party is, by design, anti-democratic. So, on the other hand, if you are China, for example, and you are surveillance-based, autocratic, know everything about your people, and that's what everybody buys into, then this type of technology is pretty awesome. So one of the two has to bend. And we're finding, by the way, that the technology is far more resilient than a democratic ideology, right? There's fragility there. So either the technology bends to embrace the values and the principles of democratic society, especially and including human individual rights, or our political systems in the free world will bend to become more autocratic. I think it's really that simple. And I think we need to begin to think about data as personhood. This is our virtual being. This is who we are. The reason why Project Liberty mounted a bid for U.S. TikTok was to elevate this issue in everyone's mind. As the senator said, scraping the information, and I'm talking about minute micro-profiling 170 million Americans, is not a good thing. Worse yet is the ability to manipulate how 170 million Americans think. This, by the way, is how all the internet technology works, not just TikTok. And I think what Mike's legislation has done is end this idea of, is it going to be shut down? Is it going to be sold? What's going to happen? The longer this goes on, the more opportunity there is to elevate this discussion and get people to understand that the current design of internet technology is inherently at odds with our democratic principles, ideals, and values. And unless and until we fix it, we're not going to actually be able to address these. We'll be constantly in a triage mode, constantly putting out fires until we exhaust ourselves and our resources. So we argue that this is just technology. It's just engineering. Let's fix it and do it from the bottom up. And let's, for the first time in 50 years of internet technology, actually have us as individuals on the internet in charge of our identity, our data, our relationships, and so forth, permissioning its use, getting value for the data, and actually being connected to the technology. I heard a woman from Google who worked there for 18 years. I heard her on a panel today say that, you know, there's a concern at Google that people are, you know, coming to the conclusion that technology no longer works for them, that they work for it. And it's about time that we come to these conclusions. So if we have technology, and I'm talking about internet technology, that's at odds with our democratic principles, we're going to get what we have now, which is, I would argue, we're barely governable. The last point is the reason why Mike's legislation went forward is because of the clear national security threat. But again, it's the same tech architecture. And I, for one, you know, I get the difference between Beijing and Silicon Valley, but I don't want all my data in either place.
Very good. That's great. I want to come back to this and get to the solutions piece, but I think you've just made a lot of new friends in Europe, because we've heard Europeans talk about values embedded in technology a lot more, frankly, than we've heard Americans do that. So, Ekaterina, let me turn to you. You're the brand new commissioner for research, innovation, and startups in Brussels, which is fantastic, former foreign minister of Bulgaria. Tell me how Europe sees this, because as Americans, we like to think, oh, come on, we're all on the same page, and don't we all have the same values and want the same things for technology? That's not what we've heard from Brussels the last few years. So give us, in your opening remarks, some thoughts on how close US and Europe really are, and do you agree with this proposition that we jointly should be running faster against the authoritarians?
Yeah, I think for you, I'm surprised that you think that Europe was thinking differently the last couple of years, because I mean, Europe, it's in European Union, it's really, I would say, even blamed to be too open. Our economy is very open. Our trade is very open. I think our import is 70% of the goods that import don't have taxes. So yeah, it's a race, to answer your first question. And yeah, I really believe that we together, only together, can win this race. So Europe, it's really open to work with USA together. I still think we are like-minded. We have, I think, differences in how we regulate the technology. Europe very often is blamed that regulates something which is still not yet on the market. We'll name AI, for example. We hear a lot of complaints coming from a private sector that our AI Act will stop development of the AI companies and startups in Europe. From the other hand, we hear that it is predictability. It's create trust in AI. And we talk about the trust in the technology, the people don't trust. And it's also an act that aims to create a trustworthy AI. We don't want AI to, for example, speaking about security, to train our people how to create bombs or other dangers for our security technologies. But we should also find a balance in Europe. I mean, should we regulate too much, or should give also the freedom of the researchers, science, and business to develop the ideas? So I think we are really close to find this balance, because first, this act don't cover research and innovation, so we can research and innovate AI and other technology without to be part of to cover from this act. I think, yes, to be able to develop technology, and I really believe that it's really important people to believe in science. Take it COVID, and what happened with the vaccines? Oh, it can happen with everything. People have to have trust in science and innovation. And to have it, they have to be sure that this is good for their health, for their families, for their life, for their wealth. If they don't think that it works for their lives, then they will start to trust. So yes, it's a race, and I think we should win this race together. We are not able to do it by ourselves. We should find a balance between over-regulate and zero regulation, because this technology can be dangerous.
Thank you. Last but not least, Mike Gallagher, you co-chaired the Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, famously. You're one of the few members of Congress that actually really worked hard and really impressively to do some basic regulation around technology. Let me start off by asking you, when we're talking about this race, you know, Senator Warner talked a lot about where the US is on various things, so did Frank. Where do you think the Chinese are? Where are they better than we are?
Yeah. Well, first, let me confess, it's hard to hear with the crowd that the senator talked about, so you just all calm down a little bit. I actually think a race is the wrong metaphor, right? I said at the first hearing that the Select Committee ever did, I said we call this a strategic competition, but it's not a polite tennis match, right? It's not some gentlemanly sporting event where you shake hands afterwards and both sides go back and, all right, I'll compete again tomorrow, right? We're not competing for competing's sake. It is more accurately a new Cold War. It is global, and the stakes are existential, in which at least one side is trying to destroy the free world. And if we don't understand it as such, I fear we will never muster the sense of urgency that is necessary to not only win that Cold War, but prevent it from becoming hot. And far from aggressively waging it, at times we're loath to even say those words. There's like a Voldemort phenomenon going on. Like if we say Cold War, suddenly we'll see an eruption of geopolitics onto the world stage. But our timidity actually makes that happen. And we have to have a combination of external pressure on the Chinese Communist Party, as well as increasing the weight of their own internal contradictions if we want to have a hope of deterring them from invading Taiwan in the short term, from controlling the commanding heights of critical technology in the midterm, and from displacing us as the world's sole superpower over the long term. So in answer to your question, where do I think they are? Technologically, I think we still have a lead, but it is a narrow lead. And I particularly get concerned when we start to combine China's advances and investments in artificial intelligence with the amount of money, men, and material they're throwing at robotics, which is an area we haven't even begun to really discuss, let alone have a national strategy around. That's where we could start to see our edge really erode. And fundamentally, we like to play by the rules. We pay ritual obeisance to this idea of the rules-based international order. But as Tobias and I were talking about before, our enemies, notably the CCP, don't give a rip about the rules-based international order. Ask anybody who's had to maintain or operate a seabed cable recently about the rules-based international order. The first rule of geopolitics, there is no higher power. There is only power. So if we want to have a nice discussion about how to maintain our technological edge, the first and foremost thing we need to do is understand the stakes of the new Cold War we're in, or the team sport, not a race, where one side is actively trying to score points while denying the other side's ability to score points, but also with a sense of urgency, as if World War III depended on it, because it does, rebuild our credible military deterrent in order to give life to our diplomatic and our technological efforts. Because, as either Frederick the Great or Freddie Mercury once said, diplomacy without armaments is like music without instruments. It doesn't work. So I guess that's a long way of me saying for 2 years in chairing the committee, I felt like I was banging my head against the wall trying to get people to understand the stakes of this competition race or new Cold War. I'm not sure how successful we've been.
Perfect. I'm sure that was a Freddie Mercury quote.
Yes.
No?
I think so.
Exactly.
I watched the Queen biopic on the flight over here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is great. The debate is now joined, and I want to get one level more specific, and that is there has been so much talking about artificial intelligence, and it is too enormous a topic to fit even into the giant Paris AI summit that just passed. I think because of the reasons that you just mentioned, because I think at least big parts of the Trump administration agree with you that it's whether you call it a new war. It's a competition.
Depends on the day.
Depends on the day, fine. But what we have heard from the Trump administration is, and I live this because I live out in Silicon Valley, is artificial intelligence, run faster, we must win, take the guardrails off because they're slowing us down. That's not what you heard Ekaterina say. Say a little bit more about that.
Me
or Mark or whoever wants to jump in.
Well, let me just say at the outset, I think our criticism of the European regulatory environment would be more powerful if our overall grand strategic approach was, yes, we have an economic competition, or China is waging economic warfare against us. Thus, there is some form of selective economic decoupling that will intensify. We're going to have to use instruments like 301 tariffs in order to push back, ensure a level playing field. But at the same time, we can't simultaneously pick a fight via 232 tariffs with our friends and allies, right? You can do one or the other, probably not both simultaneously. So the caveat of what I'm about to say is that a more nuanced approach, I think, would actually improve our position. But I do think it's fair to say that traditionally, Europe has benefited from the idea of being the largest single market and has been able to sort of dictate the pace of economic change because of that. I think that is no longer true. I think the days of deference to Brussels are over, and given the lack of innovation in AI and in the software community here, if Europe doesn't reform, it risks getting left behind. Now, what can we do to prevent that? Well, we can be a better friend and ally. We can revitalize certain bilateral trade agreements. We can look for regional digital trade agreements. We can harmonize some of our export control regimes and outbound capital flows with our European friends. But it's a very difficult thing to do right now because we do everything through executive order, and we kind of swing wildly back and forth between different interpretations.
You know, go ahead, Senator.
I was just going to jump in and say one of the things Katrina said that I think we all lived through but never fully processed until recently was post-Sputnik. You know, regardless of where innovation took place, the Americans still set the rules.
Right.
You know, I can take you through telecom, I can take you through satellites, internet, you know, compute. And as Frank, as you said, values are embedded in these technology rules and protocols and procedures that, you know, we used to send lots of engineers to, American engineers, companies went, and China has been flooding the zone on all the standard setting bodies. So that is something we have to push back, and the government, and frankly, American business needs to be more engaged. I do think, particularly with what's happening in AI in France, that there is going to be a rising European players in this. And frankly, I think that makes sense. Where we go, what I'm wrestling with now, because I agree this is not a polite competition, and one of the areas that we have a lot of bipartisan consensus on, and hopefully we can do it in a bipartisan way, because if the president does it, it won't be viewed appropriately, is rethinking our whole cyber offense doctrine. We still operate, you know, we know they're in all our systems. Most Americans think we're in their systems. We're not. Not because we don't have the capabilities, because we just have a doctrine that doesn't allow us. In playing defense only in cyber will never get us there. But when we get to AI in particular, the 301, the tariffs around chips, I've been a believer in, but I'm rethinking that right now. Because
the tariffs or the export controls?
Export control. Because of, you know, if we make a numerical limitation on GPUs, is that even going to be the chip of tomorrow as we start thinking about some of the next generation reasoning chips that may not be GPUs. So I got very involved and I'm very much in favor of the Microsoft G42 deal. Let's bring the Emiratis and the Saudis more into this network, but you've got to have security. So maybe the metric ought to be less on numerical number of chips and more about joint security agreements, government to government, agreeing on who we need to keep out. And I think this is going to be a rethinking process that we ought to be doing in concert with Europe, because candidly, well-intentioned, the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, when there were a number of European countries that were in the tier 2, they were kind of saying, what are we, chopped liver in terms of you're putting the same limitations on us as you are in Malaysia? That didn't make as much sense.
Yeah, you're right, 17 member states. Europe is changing when it's needed, and there is no doubt that we have to do more to support the scale-up phase of our companies. But I'm really not a person who is non-stop self-criticizing, which is okay, but without seeing the positive things. Because, I mean, with 5% of world population, we have 25% of the world's scientists. With 5% of world population, we have 20% of all innovation in clean tech. With, and I continue and on and on. I mean, we are number one in world scientific publication with 5% of world population. We are second in patents. China is first, not United States, actually. This is our strength, and they are huge. But we have weaknesses. I'm not saying we don't. We have to be faster, because democracy doesn't mean lack of efficiency. So democracies are usually slower than authoritarian regime. We have elections. Yes, we have elections. We change the ministers, we change the presidents and members of the parliament, the commissioners as well. We are 27 member states. In the council, there's sitting 27 prime ministers. They take decisions together. But we have to be faster, and we realize this. We have to support the scale-up phase. We are better in creating startups than the United States. But yes, some of them are moving there because actually they can faster grow. So we are seeing these challenges, and we have a clear plan how to tackle it. But I'm really supportive of what I hear here. We have to work together, really. Yeah, we have to, if it's needed, to look at our agreements, not to create barriers to each other, to work together to tackle this. And research and innovation is excellent sphere that we can work closer, and we should work closer. Because actually you talk a lot about China. I saw the data that American scientists are collaborated much more with Chinese than Europeans.
That's right.
Look at these data. I'm not saying that they shouldn't at all. But if you think that is your biggest enemy, you told them it's an enemy, it's a war. What's the reason this to happen?
I think that there's a massive opportunity in Europe actually right now for innovation. And first of all, I want to say, Project Liberty is pro-technology, pro-AI, pro-advancement. The issue we have is how the technology is advancing, right? So we've all heard of DeepSeek, right? Just spinning up this version of generative AI, and OpenAI is up in arms because it's built on the output of OpenAI, which is ironic because the big publishers in the US are up in arms because OpenAI is built on their work product. Let's demystify generative AI. Okay, it's the same technology, but a more powerful version thereof. Okay, this is scraping information, most of it now coming from people. Any great book or journal or whatever has been ingested by the machinery a long time ago. And it basically is large language models are predictive models. Just like you can assess a personality and predict how they're going to react, you can predict the next word in a sentence, the next phrase, the next paragraph, and so forth. Sometimes. Sometimes it hallucinates. Sometimes it gets it right. But the point is, it's just a very, very big piece of machinery scraping all of human creativity and then training the language models on all of that data. What's interesting to me at the moment is if Europe pivots more into your mandate around innovation and really thinks about the next generation of internet technology, you are in a really unique place to birth that, because let's face it, in the US, there's a headwind. It's called big tech, right? It's going to be very, very hard to get the changes. You mentioned that, Senator, about the difficulty in getting legislation passed. One piece, because of the national security threat of China. Here in Europe, which has been labeled Europe regulates while the US innovates, why not innovate? Why not actually be the leader on the next version? Because technology changes all the time. There's a next version of internet technology that's coming. 10 years from now, people are not going to believe that we lived in a world where there was no identity on the internet. You could pretend you're anyone, or you could be a machine. 10 years from now, people are not going to believe that you didn't own and control your data and move it around as you see fit with your permission. 10 years from now, people are not going to believe there was an internet where the apps didn't interoperate. The same as telecom. There was a day when your phone number didn't work. Your phone was not yours, first of all, and you couldn't call someone in Europe, right? Unless you also had an account with that European carrier. But then things changed. Phone numbers became portable. The telecoms became interoperable. A young person now would not believe that the world worked differently. 10 years from now, the internet is going to work differently. In Europe, because big tech doesn't live here, you can be the leader, and big tech will have to pay attention to that. Because let's reflect on the last 20 years. How well have the regulations worked alone? And I would say not well. Things have not gotten...
European regulations like GDPR, I mean, in the US, we didn't actually
well-intended,
regulate.
Totally no match for the speed, the power, the agility of big tech. And so noble, clear, the right things, but you need the tech that actually optimizes for those principles. That would be my argument. If you don't have it, big tech sits back and kind of laughs at these regulations because they're plotting. Big tech can work around them. The fines are nothing.
This is my jump-in point.
All right, jump in.
Because I shared.
But you're going back to AI.
Well, it's kind of, because again, as we know, a lot of us have tried to put some guardrails on social media. We are batting zero.
That's right.
And if anything, with the large entities going away from any kind of truth validation, we're going in, I would argue, in the wrong direction.
Well, I would say, Frank, if you had said if you had made the speech 10 years ago, we would have all nodded. But here we are 10 years later with no...
But I think Frank's idea, which I've tried to wrap my head around, about this notion of owning your data, there was the bills in California, but how that may emerge. And we've talked about this, others I've given my pitch earlier, around portability and interoperability. But I am less optimistic because Mike Gallagher decided to get rich and stay instead of being a legislator, and I'm happy for him, of our ability to put guardrails in place, but at least in America, because the power of big tech, the notion, when Schumer had all the AI bros and everybody said they want to regulate, everybody raised their hand until you put words on a paper and then, no, not those words. I wonder whether the actual technology itself, in terms of, a personal AI assistant, might be that metering entity, if you own your own data and then you also have your personalized AI chatbot that is actually filtering truth or filtering, that you're only going to receive historic or fact-based ideas, there may be a non-regulatory approach where the very technology that could be the demise of all of us could also end up giving us on an individual basis or on a societal basis the ability to put a screen in that I'm not sure we're ever going to have a regulatory framework that will keep up with that.
I agree massively with you. By the way, Dorsey, we should think about Dorsey, who started Twitter, Jack Dorsey, said we're talking far, far too much about the loss of free speech and far too little about the loss of free will. And he said more recently, we need an algorithm store, not an app store, so people actually can choose their algorithm to achieve the objectives you're talking about. We have no choice right now, right? Until there's an alternative to the existing internet, we're living with the existing internet with all the harms, right? All the damage being done. And you can just talk about, countries being barely governable, mis and disinformation.
This would introduce the concept of delegability, and I'd love feedback on this. Could you delegate a personalized chat bot that might be that guard, and could you do it at scale? I don't know if that makes sense, but luckily I'm doing it in front of the main stage of the 3,000 people that are here. So
I think the debate we're joining here, it's actually a really difficult one because you realize other than the few people up here, you do not have a lot of people in government who understand the tech at any level of detail.
We don't even have a lot of people in Munich that wants to come and hear about the tech.
Hey, Mike, how did that legislation pass so quickly? If this is correct and there's not a lot of people that understand, somebody understood something.
I want to see if you're going to tell the real story.
Okay, well, first of all, let the record
we're talking
reflect.
about the TikTok legislation.
I left.
There's no AI legislation.
Senator, I left to produce more human beings, and they cost money. They're not making me money. And if everyone had followed Frank and my Irish Catholic lead and repopulated the earth, we would have already won this Cold War competition. How did it pass so quickly? I know we're running out of time. One, we stole the senator's work, and he did a lot of the, sincerely, a lot of the yeoman's work in drafting an initial bill. We were able to sort of learn from that experience. We refined the approach. We worked with him. We worked with the executive branch. So we had a bipartisan consensus. We had the executive branch, but the bill was still dead until October 7th. And people started to see a bunch of anti-Semitic content on the platform. And our bill had legs again. And then there was a huge miscalculation by TikTok. When it became apparent that we were going to pass it out of committee, they forced sort of a pop-up on the app that allowed people to call their members of Congress. And kids were calling into their members of Congress during school hours threatening to commit suicide if TikTok went away. And for those of us who are concerned about the use of this platform for propaganda purposes or brainwashing, it sort of proved the point in the moment, and suddenly the bill passed. So it was the threat of espionage, the threat of propaganda, the good work of Senator Warner, and a few other players that all conspired. And
he got it out of a committee that is the most diverse in the House, from left to right, 50-0 after a classified. That was he did people would not have bet on, but he and his Democratic colleagues did some great.
But to your point about democracy, I mean, that was a 3-year endeavor and it failed, 100 times. And we just had to keep working it and working it.
So let me do this. We are out of time. We're getting the axe. Let me see if there's one question from the audience that's burning. Otherwise, I'm going to try to sum up.
There's too many.
Tobias.
There's a sea of hands.
Tobias.
Thank you. My takeaway from... Hi, Tobias Elwood, former defense minister in the UK. My takeaway from this conference is that there's a void developing between the United States and Europe. And this is just one arena. We've had a large speech on the main stadium, which also suggests that too. Sputnik was mentioned, 57. That was a clear indication to the American people. They could see it in the sky that there needed to be huge investment to leap ahead and win that Cold War. I don't see a Sputnik moment right now. Could you elaborate where this goes if we lose? If China, for example, harnesses quantum computing, how would it manifest itself? What does losing look like? And why do we then therefore need to win?
Ekaterina, do you want to take that one from a European perspective?
If China wins, Nobody mentioned Russia, but anyhow, I'm not surprised. We're talking about the tech race. Russia is able just to producing cheap weapons and low-quality weapons, but they go hand by hand. We should never forget the friends of and support of. And they work hand by hand, and this is my really message to Americans. I mean, they go hand by hand. If you weaken Europe through supporting Russia, we are going to lose the race because you are not able to do it alone. This is my answering of the message.
Well,
Perfect. Mike,
I think
do you want to answer?
Las Vegas rules don't apply, Tobias, right? What happens in Xinjiang won't stay in Xinjiang. What happens in Hong Kong won't stay in Hong Kong. What happens in Taiwan won't stay in Taiwan. The goal is to export a model of authoritarian control, of techno-totalitarian control. And as unimaginable as that seems to us, we could wake up one day and lose the ability to ask basic questions. Ask DeepSeek, what happened on June 4th, 1989? And you'll get like a dystopian version of a famous Simpsons episode where they encounter a monument that said, on this day in 1989, nothing happened. Like, we lose the ability to pursue and seek truth as well as our influence on the world stage.
And quantum, if you break quantum, every encrypted, secure weapon system, intellectual property is all broken open. And once you win that, there's not a time to recover the way the lag time from Sputnik to our Mercury program in the space program. The time periods have shortened so much if the adversary gets hit. And I would say, and I don't want to put Mike on the spot, but I don't think the Vice President spoke for the majority of Americans. I don't think he spoke for the majority of Republican members of Congress today. And I think that is, the 20-plus senators I was with, none of them.
I'm no longer a Republican member of Congress. So.
But none of them.
I have the answer.
He was supporting.
They were as aghast as everybody else.
And let me, so it was a setup question. It was a softball at the very end. Let me bring these disparate strands together. I worry that often this debate is totally oversimplified into, and I think we heard it a little bit today, frankly, with the Vice President. It's either run faster and there should be no regulation, which means, frankly, no values, or, oh my gosh, we slow ourselves down impossibly. I can tell you from the artificial intelligence world, which I spend a lot of time in, that is absolutely not true. And Tobias, I'm going to call out the UK. The UK has done something amazing, which you led with the Bletchley Declaration. You led with starting the UK AI Safety Institute. May it be reconstituted to be called the Non-Woke Institute or whatever, but it does very limited testing against national security harms. So making sure the artificial intelligence isn't used to create the most malicious cyber weapon we've ever seen, that it can't be the PhD student on your shoulder making chemo and bioweapons. Those are really simple things. And by the way, that testing happens in days or maybe weeks. It is not like a whole Food and Drug Administration process, and that is the type of limited thing we should absolutely keep. And everybody in the US and Europe and both parties in the US should agree. So bringing this all home, thank you all for fighting the good fight on technology and values. Thank you.